Good morning to those joining us from the United States and Canada. Good afternoon to those in the UK and across Europe, and good evening to those still with us in Asia. I'm Maurice Evan-Buffon, I'm the CEO of Armstrong Wolf, and welcome more generally to the three-day Conduct and Culture Summit 220, Purpose Over Profit. There's a series of 20 webinars over 3 days. I think we're number 5 of that 20. And I am delighted today to have an esteemed panel of individuals within the industry and those who are actually serving the industry. So initially, before going on to just discuss this session specifically, I'd just like to do some roundtable introductions. Tricia.
Hello, so I'm Tricia Lawson. I am Head of HR for the EMEA region for Wells Fargo. And I've been with Wells Fargo since 2013 in this role for the last 2.5 years.
Thank you, Tricia. George.
Thank you for me, Maurice. George Nunn. I am the COO for Banking and Markets for MP in the Americas.
Thank you. Konstantin.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. Konstantin Boyagiev. I'm a managing director out of New York, leading Protivity's global risk and compliance analytics practice, where in short, we aim to derive insight from data and translate such into better risk decision-making on all topics around conduct and culture.
Thank you, Konstantin. Alan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Meyer. I'm a partner based in New York at Oliver Wyman. I run the compliance and anti-financial crime practice for the Americas and came out of, before joining Oliver Wyman, came out of the industry in compliance roles at Barclays, Credit Suisse, and UBS. Great to be here.
Thank you very much. So today's session is talking about what we see as the 3 pillars of conduct and culture: the Office of the Chief Operating Officer, the Chief Compliance Officer, and HR. We also obviously have the benefit of Konstantin, who gives a market-wide perspective for working for Protivity, and Alan, who's been on both sides of the fence. Gamekeeper doing poacher, or the other way around, depending which way you're looking at it. The important thing, I think, that when we had a pre-discussion on actually how to handle this session, the key thing that was actually that the overall intent of the executive was well set, be it by the CEO and the COO's direct reports across to these 3 pillars, the COO, the Chief Compliance Officer, and HR. Everyone had the collective intent and understanding of the importance of culture and conduct. But the question always remains, and particularly when we look from the context of the COO, Office of the COO, is actually how do you go about this? There may be a collective intent, the capital in position to invest in it, but actually the challenge is actually how to operationalize it and then embed it into the organization. So therefore, what I'm going to open up to the panel is on the first question is really asking the question of who bears the responsibility in shaping culture. If we take it that the CEO is the accountable executive and setting that intent, it's actually who bears the responsibility and in what way do they execute that responsibility. And I'm going to pass to Alan, first of all, to give your views, Alan, on opening up the conversation and bringing in your peers of the panel.
Sure. So it's obviously a extremely important question, and maybe I can start it off with like a little story. In one of the experiences that I had at one of the banks I was at, when there's a new CEO put in place, and the first thing he did was have an offsite of the senior management team. You know, there was always the on your code of conduct and up on your website, you know, here's our purpose and values. And the CEO said, like, let's scrap that. Let's take out a white piece of paper and let's collectively design new purpose and values. And so we had like a 2-day session, and, you know, I was a little bit cynical about it going in. You know, is this going to work? And like, don't we have more pressing things to talk about, you know, actual control issues, business issues, or whatever. And it turned out to be a great way of sort of getting past the words, because everybody has the words. And actually we came out with some changes, and like all the senior management team felt like they owned it going forward. You know, they own those statements of purpose and values in a way that in the past it would have just been words, that are on everybody's code of conduct. And they were like similar words to what everybody has on their website, because there's only so much variety you can have. But I just tell that anecdote that, the best way to like have ownership of culture is to, have your senior management team buy into it, and be part of creating it as much as you can and living it. And when you create those words yourself, it's a different story than just inheriting, multiple, passed down generations of it. So I don't know, Maurice, if that helps kick off the dialogue, but thought it would be a good starting point.
I think it's an interesting point, isn't it? That we've all walked into the pearly marble corridors of different banks and asset managers, and there's a list of all fundamentally saying the same thing, that each firm has paid probably a multitude to a market agency to reverse out the corridor, go and get hold of the thesaurus and say, we've got to say that, but using different words. And I think that's the challenge that we have, is actually how do you take those words and actually how you drive them into the organizations. That's a really interesting point to start with, given a specific example that you've experienced really from a leadership perspective, getting you all engaged. George, what's your view in relation to the responsibility? Whose responsibility is it, and how do you go about then actually embedding a cultural change?
So for sure, as you alluded, the CEO, it starts from the top, right? But the actual ownership of the responsibility of executing it, it's pretty much everyone in the organization. And simply stating this is our purpose, this is the conduct we want to see, that's not enough. You got to think about what incentives have you put in place. What behaviors do you no longer wish to see, and have a process where you're acknowledging these items. So a message from the top helps, an acceptance that the culture that you had as a firm or as an industry 10 to 20 years ago is no longer the culture that you will accept. And that in itself requires A, some pondering of it, B, after that reflection, sharing with your teams examples of things that may still be ongoing that you no longer find acceptable, and allowing teams to feel that if they raise their hand about, this is not the culture that we should have, I noticed the following behavior, that is an acceptable communication. So it is not as straightforward as you said of just listing the items and saying, okay, that's who we are, let's go from there. Getting there is a journey in itself. Yes, it's led by the leadership team, but to embrace that, the leadership team have to walk the talk. So what are the incentives? Are they modifying incentives? And what are they highlighting coming from their staff as to, I saw this event and I'm bringing it to the broader attention because this is no longer acceptable. So yes, responsibility to all. Obviously, at the end of the day, the leadership has to take the first pass, but creating a culture that is very different from where we were 15 years ago, it's a lot of work, takes time.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much for those additional insights. Trish, if I then could come to you then from your perspectives. Obviously, we've had a view from both the state management consultant and the double hat from previous head of compliance, now the COO. Then you come from the HR perspective. What's your view in relation to who bears the responsibility and who shares the responsibility for culture?
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, I agree that it's really important that this is owned from the top, and what Alan described in terms of the sort of getting buy-in from senior leadership is really important. But I think the other thing to think about is that there's probably no company's culture statement that if you read it, you thought, actually, I don't want to join that company. I don't like that culture, because it's always very positive. You know, they say shades of the same thing in different ways, in a way that suits their own style. And I think, you know, the point that George made about calling out when the behaviors that we don't want to see can sometimes be more powerful when you're bringing that down into how does this actually feel? What do we experience day to day? What is the culture in each of the teams? What behaviors are managers showing? That there is some power in calling out the behaviors that are not acceptable, that might in the past have been okay. And I also think that there is a danger if you are too sort of optimistic about your culture, and the experience day to day is something quite different, that in itself can be more damaging than positive. That you've got to sort of connect the day to day experience and change, and calling out things that need to change, and recognizing the things that are aligned to the culture that we want to be, to turn this lofty statement into something that people are actually experiencing and working towards. And you know, it's a journey, isn't it? It's not something we're ever going to achieve in absolute terms. So I think that middle piece is really, really important, living it.
Thank you very much, Trish. I think it's interesting that we've used the tone from the top, and then this came from the sort of when we're looking at the journey of the SCA in relation to sort of tone from the top, tone from the bottom, tone within, you know, and then actually now going from culture to purpose, there's so many different ingredients and interpretations on this. And as you said, that there's not one company that has a strap line that you think actually if that company is as they define what their culture is, I think there would be a queue outside every door. Constantine, what's your view in relation to having a collective view and really looking at sort of that you speak to multitude of different clients across financial services? I'm just wondering whether you can give any views in relation to your views on the ownership and collective responsibility in relation to shaping culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I fully agree with the views that, you know, Alan, George, and Tricia expressed, that while accountability starts at the very top, the responsibility really resides with all of us. It trickles across the org. I feel that everybody does own a responsibility, whether formally or informally, for shaping culture. You know, for 13 years, I was actually in industry and I was a CRO, and I worked very closely with kind of that triumvirate of the COO, CCO, head of HR, so I could personally attest. And, you know, to a large extent, we as employees, regardless of rank, I feel own that agenda of shaping, building, and fostering a stronger culture that's grounded on ethical conduct and self-correcting behavior. So to me, incentivizing as well as positively reinforcing somewhat good behavior is key, but at the same time, ensuring that the opposite is not tolerated, and if it ever exhibits itself, has notable ramifications and repercussions. So my team and I often get brought in across, you know, banks, commercial and retail institutions, capital markets players, asset managers, to really help somewhat foster culture, but also help eradicate misconduct or unwanted behavior. George mentioned somewhat having incentives and disincentives related to what is acceptable and not. And that's absolutely key, to kind of have both in robust processes around. So regardless of which part of financial services, whether it's insurance, capital markets, or banking, those are some of the core common elements that we see for, you know, institutions looking to establish a very somewhat deep culture based on, again, ethical behavior and self-correcting action.
Thanks, Constantine. So there's a starting point. We've all started at the top. And actually, I'm not surprised by the commonality and the coalescence in relation to what the views that just given. And actually, probably those who are listening aren't either. And I think that's one of the challenges that you have, is that on one level, it sounds remarkably simple to get this right. We've all got to be on the same page. We've all got to walk the talk. You've got to have the right level of incentives. But for one reason or another, the industry as a whole, and not just this industry, struggles with its implementation and its management and its evolution. So what I want to do is just take it down a level now to each one of these pillars. And it's interesting, one of the forums that I ran in New York about a couple of years ago, it was on this subject, and one of the CEOs were commented, there's too many people think they own culture. And that's what the problem is, that they're looking at the same problem through nuance or different lens, and that and they're not aligned to this, to actually delivering the same result, which is the intent of the CEO, but there was no sense of coordination in effort. There was that spirit of agreement, of camaraderie in relation to principles, but actually operationalizing it consistently and understanding which part of the jigsaw fitted in with each other wasn't felt as if that was in place. It may be now 2 years on, but I'm just going to go then, Trish, if we could start with you in relation to, I mean, historically, before the world of 2008 and culture was very much seen as the domain of HR in many ways. And it was actually in the general narrative of leadership, but actually it wasn't really embraced. And I'm just thinking from your perspective, could you summarize your view of your career, having been in HR, and actually how that's run parallel in relation to the fine tuning and changing of the importance of culture, and where you think the role of HR sits now in partnership to other component parts of the business?
Yeah, yes. I mean, you're absolutely right. If you go back 15, 20 years, then culture was one of those things that was a sort of soft issue that was part of HR. It was part of perhaps the way that we do things, which are looked after by HR, the how. I mean, from Wells Fargo's experience, Wells Fargo came through the 2008 financial crisis relatively unscathed, hadn't had the same sort of, well, it had an image of being risk averse and therefore wasn't as exposed to a lot of the issues that came out then. But we've since then had some quite significant conduct and culture problems to work through at a later date that have been equally impactful. So, we had problems with sales practices in the US in 2015, 2016 that you'll probably all be aware of, and that has had a really fundamental effect on how we as an organization think about and manage conduct and culture. Because in many ways, the situations that we found ourselves facing were the unintended consequences of things that were meant to be driving a certain type of behaviors that ended up inadvertently and quite pervasively, without people really taking stock of what was happening, driving behaviors that were not the right behaviors. At the same time as looking as if they would be driving the right type of behaviors. And so I think that that took conduct and culture very much into the heart of the organization and outside of it being HR. And I think that's been happening across the industry in that now it isn't, culture, conduct is seen very much as a compliance, has a very, very key role to play in that. And HR is more of it's part of what we do, but we work with the other functions, with senior leadership to support conduct and culture more generally. And so it's definitely not within HR's remit anymore to be the owners of it. But I still think we've got an important part to play in terms of the performance management and how objectives are set and the moving from measuring what to how. There are lots of things that HR is responsible for that play into conduct, disciplinary processes, the outcomes, grievance handling, employee relations activities, penalizing, dealing with mistakes that have happened, but it's in conjunction now with the broader agenda and other departments, functions, senior leaders to deal with this more as an organization as a whole and look internally at where we are and what we need to do to keep changing.
And do you feel then where you've arrived now? I know that before we had a conversation last week around taking as an example, the conduct committee assessing a specific incident, the COO around the table, the chief risk officer, the compliance officer, and the head of HR, and dissecting a conduct issue and then coming up with a collective decision in relation to the outcome of that. But do you feel with it that the mandate of HR in relation to these two aspects, and culture and conduct, is sufficiently well determined and defined and empowered to play the role you need for you feel as HR to make the impact it can do?
Well, I don't think we can do it in isolation. I think the power comes in forums such as the Conduct Committee, such as the risk governance forums, remuneration governance, of which HR plays a key role, but it does it with other functions. And I think that's where the power comes. So I don't think HR doesn't have the power on its own. But the conduct forum is a really powerful forum. The conduct panel, which you've just described, which we would convene to consider fitness and propriety if there's been an incident, and the discussions that come out of that over, what is significant, where do you draw the line, is the sort of example of stealing a sandwich from the canteen versus trading, misleading a client, and all the things along the scale, and also the looking at what trends are we seeing here, and conversations around, are people willing to raise their hand and say when things have gone wrong, or do they feel frightened because we now have the conduct panel and the fitness, the conduct rules. So I think we have to lock arms and deal with this together, and that's where the strength comes. And I would bring the HR expertise around knowledge of HR, the HR best practices, thinking about impacts on people and how people operate. But we work together very much as a team.
Thank you, Tricia. Alan, if I can then bring you in then if we look from a compliance perspective, and the role of compliance as it's evolved over the last since probably 2008-9 through the new regulatory era to where we've got to today. If you ask most people where do you position compliance in the spectrum between conduct and culture, they would see you as wearing a conduct hat, and as opposed to the hat of culture would pass to HR, and then actually the COO, do they have one hat? Do they have half a hat? Do they have no hat? But one of the things that I was also interested in is how you perceive the role of the defined role and perceived role of compliance as actually very much in the conduct space. And but actually, how do you then marry to how do you turn that into a leadership and shaping culture? How do you take that dual role? And I think we've got to be careful probably here, before we hand on to George, is actually the influence of regulation around shaping activities which could impede potential culture, like the ever-resident challenge around the 3 lines of defense model and the stand 2 lines. Does that produce protection and controls, or does it produce conflict and fractures in culture? So, Alan, if I could ask you to take us on the journey from over the last 10 years of compliance, their role in conduct and culture, and where you think it is now and where you think the challenges are, that would be great. And then we can leapfrog into George's intro.
Yeah, broad question. 10 years of the conduct culture journey. So how much time do you have? But no. So yeah, I've been sort of at the point of the spear on conduct risk programs back from the beginning. For the various roles I had in the industry prior to be into consulting, but also into my consulting career too. I mean, conduct, I think, is quite a bit easier in a way. It's not easy, but it's quite a bit more concrete than culture. And, I've stood up conduct programs, obviously you begin with the definition and you have to set up a framework, and the framework was there sort of in a murky way historically, because, a lot of conduct risks are violations of sort of regulations that compliance was looking after already. Some sort of over time overlapped with HR in terms some of the employee conduct like harassment. So I've seen lots of sort of varieties of lineups on sort of how to stand up a conduct program. Ultimately, it ends up in your taxonomy as a risk. It has governance, a committee, and sort of compliance has in most banks been at the point of kind of putting that framework together and bringing it to life, and measurement and reporting and hotlines so that there's ability to go beyond the supervisory structure to report things. And I've seen some banks that sort of set out with a partnership between HR and compliance in setting it up. But I would say probably for conduct risk management, compliance has been the leading oar. And obviously, as you think about culture, conduct, and I think Trisha said this nicely, and so did George, bad conduct and penalizing and performance reviews and all those things sort of play into their levers of culture, but they're sort of like the negative levers of culture. Although some banks have begun to sort of explore how do you reward positive conduct. I think sort of, as you move towards sort of culture and conduct together, I do think obviously that HR, beginning where I started of like, it's the board, it's the senior management, but I do think sort of, compliance and HR need to be partnered up, as well as maybe governance needs to be evolved to be broader than just, the hammer of conduct risk when somebody does something that they shouldn't have done or that violates a policy, and then, there's the questions of moving in broader, like to ethics rather than just rules-based thinking, which is more of a cult, really begins to enforce culture more than just sort of rules and policies. So, so I think there's not one formulation of it, but I do see increasing partnership between HR and compliance as sort of the guardians, functions that are, and risk to some extent too, become sort of the guardians of culture and then sort of defining the roles and responsibilities across those functions, varies a bit by bank. And then obviously, first line, as you said, first line ownership of it. You could have the best program, you could have the best governance, you can have the best documentation, but unless you get the sort of the first line after it, and owning it and driving it, then, you will have a very thin response. You could have the best program and still have the lousiest culture, right? If it's sort of not being owned by key stakeholders in the first line.
Okay, Alan, so let's propose a slightly different question then. So with your President Oliver Wyman hat on, client gets you in and says, right, we've got a problem with culture. We need to change this culture. And from your experience, you've probably been asked a variant of that in different ways and different guises, but fundamentally that's what they're seeking to do. For your experience, what would you say what frustrates or inhibits the ability of that organization to take on board your counsel or their own counsel to actually drive cultural change? On the flip side on the positive side, where do you think it has worked and worked well?
Yeah, wow. So that's a big one. So what hasn't worked is, I think it's sort of, how it's thinking about, it's easy to sort of, as I said, have statements about what you want your culture to be, but it's really about sort of the system of checks and balances. Actually, even before that, it's sort of understanding where you are is a challenge. Like, surveys are sort of like shots in the dark and they give you some useful data. But I mean, the reality is sort of to get an understanding of what, and there's many cultures, right, in a bank. Different business lines have different cultures, different regions have different cultures, different countries have different culture, different regulatory disciplines that have sort of given rise to that culture, different business environments, different business lines. So it's often really like, and typically like, sometimes a culture project is about something has gone wrong, in one of those bits, and then you need to really figure out like, how do I diagnose sort of more broadly what the story is with my culture? And until you understand like, what you need to work on, it's hard to sort of set up a program. And then once you set up a program, it's about all the things that we've talked about, like, good rewards and performance appraisals and governance and committees and statements at the top of the house. So that's sort of, I think there's often like something's happened and I want to just hit that nail, and then my culture will be fixed. But it's often like you don't really know where you are in these large global banks, and so that's a bit of an issue, just diagnosing where you are. And then the second question was what works well? I'm sorry.
Yes, yeah. So can you give an example where it's worked surprisingly well, where if culture's a journey, that sounds a bit of a cliche, and it's not going to something you design the policy today, you enact it tomorrow, and by next Monday you're feeling the benefit of it. But actually, there will, if you've given examples of where you've seen faster progress than you had anticipated, and was there any reason behind that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to quickly get your culture to change. So I'm not sure there's the silver bullet to say, if I do X, this will happen. I mean, I think you have to have, it has to be full bore. That's, I think it's just not like, there's some magic wand. It has to be like at some of the ones that I've seen, we had senior managers cascade for, multi-hour sessions, both at the beginning of sort of the initiative, and then over time, it takes, you have to look at all of your processes. How does compliance function? First line, how does the second line operate? It's a very holistic sort of thing to turn around. But I think, the most effective things I've seen where there's it's not a superficial effort. Senior managers, really put a lot of effort into it and buy into the program and spend time rolling it out to their teams and making sure their teams understand what matters. And then I think George said this, I'm taking up a lot of time, I know, is living it, right? I mean, you got to have the demonstration of what the new culture is by the leaders, or else it's so fragile and can be undermined so quickly. If people are looking for people not to walk the walk, and as soon as somebody doesn't walk the walk, it unravels pretty quickly. So I don't have an easy prescription, take this pill and your culture will change. But I have seen, with a concerted effort, material change happen in a reasonable amount of time.
That's interesting conclusions in relation to a concerted effort. I think that's what's needed. It's not the silver bullet. It's a continued effort over a period of time. George, so if we could then come to the role of the COO in relation to your experiences, actually you having been in the business and then being the COO, and actually looking at the partnership with compliance and with HR. What's your view of how the role of the COO has evolved, even since you've been in the seat yourself, and the expectations on it, and potentially where you see the COO role could potentially add greater value, being at the hub and actually helping shape culture?
So I've been listening very interestedly in both Trisha and Alan's comments, and in the end, banks are there for providing for their shareholders, employees, and stakeholders. And the focus on culture and conduct is really the result of many cases of bad conduct, leading ultimately to losses for shareholders, employees, and stakeholders. And so in thinking about this, the incentives really are at the heart of it. In a setup that the industry has, where it's you eat what you kill, we have concrete KPIs, maximize that KPI, and that's your incentive, then you're not really addressing your statement of purpose, culture, conduct, etc. So if you reframe it a bit, it's around you want your entire staff, but in particular, you want your managers to be incented with the long-term performance of the institution. And so when you're taking long-term lens, and long-term really means 5 to 10 years, It's not 1 year. Then you start to reflect, okay, do I have the right set of incentives in place for my staff to get the protection of the firm and ultimately the conduct and culture that I want to see. And so, yeah, I think the industry in this regard probably still has room to improve or to think about it, that how do you structure incentive compensation? What are the metrics and how do you structure the way we compensate people? And can you more directly bring in the type of behaviors you want to see into how people are compensated? So a simple example would be cross-selling, incentivizing teams from multiple areas of the firm to sell something together. Well, that's the behavior you want to see. Great. When you do see it, and it's usually very hard to do, but when you do see it, you want to call it out and you want to reward the people who do it, because it's generally speaking rare. And why is it rare? It's again comes back to the you eat what you kill mentality. That is a difficult thing to tone down. And in that regard, what Trisha brought up about Wells, I'd be interested in your commenting on how has the firm looked to change that. So then back to your question, Maurice, in terms of, okay, how does the COO help with these particular things? I mean, it is part of how do you design the processes and controls, and because, we're at the center of, okay, think through the KPIs and now produce the metrics and so on. So we can do that, but we have to go beyond now of not just, okay, yes, here's the absolute metric of revenue production per client, number of visits, et cetera, and look more into what Trisha mentioned, the how. How was that done? And what are the hows that you want to reward, and how do you observe them? And what are the hows that you want to disincentivize? And when you see them, you which is back to the carrot and stick question we were having earlier. We are very good at figuring out the sticks. We've got lots and lots of sticks, not enough carrots. And that's why, if we clean it up and say, at the end of the day, who do we want aligned? We want our staff and our managers aligned with the long-term interests of the shareholders. So if you're aligned on that basis, and you're taking a 10-year horizon on what's good for the firm for a 10-year out, it's going to trickle down into, okay, that's the type of culture I want to promote, and that's the type of conduct I will monitor for to protect my long-term interests. Long-winded answer, sorry.
Thank you, George. So I think actually it's a good pivot to Konstantin in relation to a question I've just had in. And actually, it captures what you said right at the beginning, George, about the carrots and sticks, and actually that's come through with both what Alan and Trisha said. So the question was, in my experience, organizations prefer to focus on culture conversations, on boosting incentives for good conduct and having a just culture. Where do you think the balance is in driving culture via focus on good conduct versus bad conduct? So, and this seems to be the focus of how do you pivot from a period where we've had the punishments, we've had the regulations, we've had, as you said that, George, the outcome, the journey to actually having good conduct and a strong behavior, a strong culture can be, if you look back, can actually be how an organization has addressed a series of bad conduct issues and learned from each to actually help the culture evolve. But so, Konstantin, if you're then looking, if we take the conversation now, we've looked at the 3 pillars, and then we're going to take it to more of an umbrella view. And I just repeat that question. In my experience, organizations prefer to focus on culture conversations, on boosting incentives for good conduct and having a just culture. Where do you think the balance is in driving culture via focus on good conduct versus bad conduct?
Yeah, really good question, Maurice. And I could take that from the point of view of both, a former industry practitioner as well as, advisory lens, given that conduct and culture is really a cross-industry topic and industry agnostic. So there is an inflection point, I feel. And George mentioned, the carrots and the sticks. I feel, especially if I look back to my early years in my professional career, maybe it was the opposite, where there were a lot of carrots and not necessarily enough sticks, right? Where you were somewhat incentivizing to some extent even, riskier and risk-taking behavior, because the incentives were such. And, and if you were to do the opposite, it was somewhat a lenient, somewhat slap on the wrist. And I think that's where we've seen some of the evolution of conduct and culture that, in my early professional experience years, and this is, I started in advisory, helping the likes of Enron and LTCM, famous or infamous names, and then, sitting on a trading floor, monitoring trading businesses, seeing firsthand market abuse, collusion, manipulation, spoofing, sales malpractices, customer harm, elderly abuse, suitability, yada, yada, yada. I think early on, there was this thought of just, misconduct is just the cost of doing business. We're always going to have it. Let's just accept it. And frankly, regulators, I felt, were pretty lenient in those times as well, where more often than not, you got a somewhat soft slap on the wrist, especially if you came and said, mea culpa, we've discovered this was happening under our watch. Often it was even a non-public settlement. And usually the recommendation was essentially throw more bodies at the problem, hire more people in compliance, HR risk, internal audit, but not necessarily solve the problem. And hence why I felt there were a lot of carrots, because, if you were, let's say, in a front office capacity and implicated of one of these things, well, the worst that really happened to you is maybe, you lost your licenses, but you could have still gone to a hedge fund and done pretty much the same thing. So, I've seen somewhat that evolution where, regulators have certainly somewhat changed that approach. Fines are now actually in the billions, right? Because part of that is the castigatory nature and the sticks nature, but also really this focus on reputational impacts. We've actually done some even quantitative analyses of what does reputational cost really ultimately cost companies and shareholders. We've analyzed, large, financial institutions after major events, whether it was, collusive practices or rogue trading, and it's been pretty material. So, the key is somewhat finding that right inflection point where you've got enough incentives for good behavior, but also pretty strict, disincentives for quite the opposite. So kind of finding that right inflection point between having the carrots, because you want to incentivize, they said, returning, value to your stakeholders, but doing so in a manner that's consistent with, an established culture, norm, and defined somewhat, behavior.
Thanks, Constantine. Can I ask you a similar question then? So obviously you had many years as the industry practitioner. Now you're on the stage where you're speaking to multiple participants across the industry. Yeah, the same question I gave to Alan is that if you think about your experience where you, from an advisory perspective, can you give an example of where, whether it's specifically to address a specific conduct issue, which has prompted we need to review the whole culture. But when you've been brought in by a client to say, like, we've got a cultural problem or that we need to get ourselves online, can you give an example of where you think that it's worked well and why you think it's worked well in relation to that organization embracing this challenge and putting certain things? How did they operationalize it? What are the couple of takeaways that you think actually that worked well? It may be very granular, very simplistic. Just wonder whether you could give any insights.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the back of what Alan said, sadly, there is no silver bullet or single pill that cures your headache and indigestion, right, and joint pain. So it's really, somewhat looking at this, a lot more holistically. So where I've seen some institutions really be more than just aspirational, somewhat succeed in this journey is where they've kind of gone away from this, as I said, prevailing mentality. It's the cost of doing business, right? We're always, big institution operating globally, we're always going to have somewhat bad actors. So that's one, kind of having the right mentality. Two is ensuring that a lot of these functions do not operate in a siloed approach, where this is not an HR problem, this is not a compliance problem, this is actually a general problem, where you actually have really various forms at the C level, where a chief data officer comes in and says, well, behavioral risk, that's a data problem, I could help. The chief analytics officer says behavioral is dynamic and changes over time, I could help. Obviously, compliance, HR, risk, internal audit. So being able to somewhat take what often that's part of the danger, where can you herd all these cats And the idea is you can, because there is a common agenda, and don't kind of neither operate too siloed nor somewhat, too many chefs in the kitchen, so to speak. And then somewhat being able to, take the strategic view of things, but don't just think what Nirvana could look like. Start working somewhat tactically at that, where you could start seeing the forest from the trees. Often, when we come in, it's usually, as a result of, negative press, and it's usually very defined use cases. We have a problem with X. We have a problem with Y. And it's actually, if you take a step back, it's all somewhat related to conduct and culture, that these are just use cases that somewhat manifest themselves in various dimensions, but you look at it collectively, it's really under one common theme. So to me, that's been the difference between organizations that have, largely talked about it, but it's remained operational, or again, having the right mentality, the lack of the siloed approach, and being able to see the bigger picture as well.
Thanks so much, Konstantin. So we've got 15 minutes left, and I've just got one more question that's come in, which is actually aligned to one of the other questions that I've pre-prepared. For those that listen in, if we've got any other questions, please do send them through to Gwen. So one of the questions that's come in, where it is more broadly speaking around one jacket doesn't fit all. In other words, the culture, when you're in a global organization where you can't actually have a single approach to actually setting that culture for global, from different regions, different locations, different jurisdictions. And in fact, the question raises the point around that certain organizations have a particular Anglo-Saxon view of the world, so for the US and say the European houses or the British banks. And actually that's the view of culture that they install, and even the language that they use. And if you look at, say, the use of language, where the way that you engage in the US is different to way, say, the Brits engage, is different to how the French engage. So some get frustrated or annoyed by others, and some see actually, but that's pretty rude. And we say, well, no, that's not rude. That's just part of our culture. That's how we communicate. So the Americans have a wonderful sense of candor and to get to the point. And you could say sometimes the Brits sort of tip-tap around and they're too polite on occasion. So the question coming here is that's been brought up is actually, so you can actually have an executive leadership team, which has the intent. You can have an executive leadership team which is committed to a culture and cornerstones of that culture. But the challenges, for example, that Wells has in the UK, a lot of it in relation to the regulatory environment and the role of the FCA is somewhat different from a principles approach to say, actually, your counterparts in the US has got a rules-based approach to a lot of the regulation. Puts it an additional layer of challenge when you're trying to actually move an organization as a whole in a cultural direction. And Trisha, can I bring you in on that point then? So we're looping around that we've actually had some great contributions in relation to how you shape culture, and actually the role of HR, the role of compliance, the role of the COO's office, and actually here's examples of worked well. How do you then pivot that in relation to you're a regional head of HR working to a global organization in the US, where there is not a disconnect in relation to you, but certainly there's some challenges in relation to the nuance of your world compared to the parent organization in the US. And the flip side, whether we're working to an organization headquartered out of Asia, working back into the UK or the US or in Europe, etc. Just that dynamic. How do you think the culture is addressed in that context?
So, I mean, this is touching on another very big topic that we probably haven't got enough time to sort of go into a deep dive on this. But I think the diversity part of this is really, really important. And, recognizing that Wells is a global organization, and ensuring that we are doing things as a company to have diverse voices and diverse opinions and decision making, I think is going to strengthen the culture globally. And it's, we're not there yet. We are, as you've described, in that we are an enormous organization in the US, and the international regions are relatively small in comparison in terms of the size of the population. So in many ways, the culture is driven from the US. And we have, as part of our own cultural transformation, some global expectations that have been set by senior leadership that all of us have, that effectively is that sort of walking the talk of what is Wells, what are its values, what is it trying to do, and every employee signs up as part of their own objectives to a set of global expectations, and you know, those will translate differently around the world. And the word that you used, Maurice, candor, is in there as one of the things, which is, you know, being straightforward. And you would describe this in different ways in different cultures, and it might even show up slightly differently as to what does that really mean when you're operating in the US, or you're operating in Germany, or in France, or in China. It will look different. But I think what is important in terms of driving the cultural change is to hear all those voices, and to make sure that we have enough cultural diversity in all ways of thought and experience and ethnicity to understand those differences and to incorporate them into the whole along that journey. To come back to the previous discussion, it is events, it is failures, it's things like the platform that Black Lives Matter gave the Black community, or the platform that you have a regulatory failure, or you know, we have a situation where there's been something that has gone awry. It's the way you handle that and the way you learn from it that is an enabler of driving change in the future. So it's not to say that failure is a good thing, but actually it's what drives us forward. And it's the honesty and the sort of humility over learning from it, and not turning that into a blame. You know, we need to hang these people out to dry, where compliance completely failed, they hadn't got the right policy in place, or HR didn't run the right appraisal system, or the incentives are all wrong. It's like, well, let's learn from it and hear all those different voices and then move forward. And I think that's the way that it will bring it to life. And as a global organization, you have to do that globally.
So would you then, one of the points of conclusion then, Tris, if we're looking at the segmented responsibilities that help shape culture, is when we're looking at inclusion in its many different facets that you've talked about, you know, so the diversity of voice and opinions, for example, is that a role that you think that should be, that is a key role that HR can play in relation to making sure it's contributing to the evolution and the positive evolution of culture? And should that be more of a direct responsibility of HR and an indirect responsibility and acceptability by, say, compliance and operations working with HR?
I mean, inclusivity and diversity, I don't see it as being a specific compliance responsibility any more than any other group. I think HR has a key role to play in that people come in and out of the organization, and the tone is a little bit set by that. But actually, you know, in the same way as culture, I think it has to be much, much broader than that, in that it's who do you, you know, as a manager, who do you bring to the table when you've got a problem to understand it, and how does that look? You know, that it's got to be day to day. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, so because actually it's interesting you say that in relation to, it's almost like creating the commercial case for inclusion, a bit like conduct. The conduct agenda that many CEOs, when I've spoken to them, are saying that, that what we've got to do is we've got to create the commercial case for conduct. You've got, yes. What is the output from this? Because ultimately the banks are here to serve their clients and serve, etc. But actually that's about making profitable and return on investment. So if you can then pivot, on one side we all know it's the right thing to do, and that's around purpose, be it conduct or inclusion. But actually, how do you quantify that? From a qualitative perspective, it's absolutely the right thing to do. But actually, let's make the commercial case for it, and then it becomes more palatable for those who are in the business. Oh, I can see if we do this, we're going to get a better result.
Yes.
So then if I'm going to go to George, from a CEO perspective then, George, on this question of, now you're working for a French bank in the US, looking back into Europe and into Paris, and actually sort of the the multi-dimensions relation to looking at a different view of the world from a French headquartered organization into the US entity. How do you think the challenges are in relation to creating a consistent approach to culture and conduct, and actually, sort of reward or carrot and sticks within that? Is that something that is a tangible journey that you've had to be on how to make this work? Or what's your views on that particular challenge, George?
It's tricky because we do operate globally. So we have effectively every regulator cares. And so we have to reflect both the principles-based approach in the UK, the rules-based approach in the US, and then come up with a happy medium. At the end, what we have been looking to do is some of the things that we commented on earlier, which is a yes message from the CEO, but complementing it in every opportunity that there is a town hall to reflect on some aspect of that so that it's being included in the dialogue on a regular basis. Then we've discovered or feel that training staff through case studies is very effective. And so we have a mix of our leaders, our leadership team, and then ambassadors from within every business act as the case host and present the case for discussion with a group of staff. And they're most effective. The cases that are most effective are the gray ones, where there are many ways to look at it, many different approaches that you could solve it, because that creates a very dynamic discussion. And ultimately, the nature of the solutions all revolve around, okay, is this who we are? Is this the conduct we want to have everyone portray? And so we've taken it very systematically from the conduct lens, but really taking it from there to culture. And to Trisha's point regarding diversity, it's all interlinked. And so how do you reflect the diversity that you want to see in your case studies to others? So at the end, yeah, we were subject to every regulator in the world having an opinion and a view, and we have to ensure that we are consistent to all. So it's quite hard work. And therefore, approaches of this type, where your message from above, consistent messaging through the communication channels, training people, using case studies. And the last piece, which is the one that we've debated a bit, is on the incentive side, we've done some work. I think that's still an area where we have to keep cycling, in that it's very easy to turn to, okay, this is what this, I'm going to have a stick for this sort of thing. Those are, well, usually those are very bright lines. So it's relatively straightforward to say, okay, if I see this, this is a problem. And you want to graduate that to, again, long-term view, what's in the best interest of the firm, the shareholders, the stakeholders at large, and how do you get people to think that way and incent that way?
Great, thank you, George. So we've got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask one quick question of you, George, for a quick answer, then come to Alan and then Constantine. So you're the COO, and the CEO goes to you. George, what's the primary and singular responsibility that the COO occupies in relation to helping shape culture?
Well, the most obvious day-to-day piece is ensure that systems, processes are in place to allow us to have a good view as to what's going on. So that is by far the first. The secondary one is more the soft of what are we communicating to people.
So you go for the control environment first, and then the trailing foot after that.
You asked, when the CEO turns to the COO, what do they ask?
Yeah. Okay.
Processes and systems.
The CEO is nodding again. Thank you, George. And so Alan, and then same question to Constantine. Compliance. CEO says to you, so Alan, look what's happened over the last 10 years. We're moving forward. Can you tell me what the principal responsibility is or compliance in relation to shaping culture and then supporting the conduct agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing goes back to what compliance does for a living, is making sure that there is a clear understanding of the regulations that apply. There's a clear statement of that so employees can understand it, and that you're helping the bank look ahead of the curve about what sort of how regulatory expectations are going to evolve. So you need to sort of like, you need to sort of be part of the group that manages conduct and culture, but you also need to be very, very focused on your core mission.
Thank you, Alan. So that's more, I say, governance and controls and working within the regulatory environment to help shape culture. Constantine, same question.
Sure, I fully agree with both what George and Alan said. And to me, whether it's a formal defined somewhat role or a plus one, to me, the compliance function should also be above everything that was just mentioned, kind of act as this central magnetic, central centrifugal force in driving the conduct agenda of the future. They said a lot of stakeholders and protagonists where, compliance could somewhat be that connectivity tissue and gel that unites, an otherwise, quilted fabric, if you will. So to me, that would be one of definitely, the agenda items for CCO.
Excellent. I would probably take what you've just said and apply that to the COO, personally speaking. But that's what this debate's been about, hasn't it? So I would like to thank the four of you for your contributions. Hopefully those listening, you found it enlightening. And see the three-legged table, of which the CEO is the top, and the three legs of compliance and HR and the COO. I think the summary is if one of those legs is missing, then the table will fall over. And if one of them is unsteady, then at best the table will rock. So actually it's independence, but codependence. So we need all of you is what we need. And obviously we need fine consulting and advisory firms like Protiviti and Oliver Wyman to help you on your way. I thought I'd just add that. Thank you very much for your contributions. It is available on podcast. I hope we've all enjoyed it. And hopefully we'll be seeing you all and listening in over the next 3 days. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well.